In the years I have shepherded the sins and the wrongdoings of this parish, never have I been exposed to the evils which have been shared with me this evening. Like the majority of this community, I was aware that Parliament had passed a resolution to evacuate Wormwood Scrubs not long after the outbreak of hostilities. Part of my duties had always been to attend the prison, to hear the confessions of those sentenced to a lifetime imprisonment or a walk to the gallows. I would be deceitful were I tried to convince you that the loss of those duties had been anything other than a welcome relief. There had been a rumour that a secretive part of the War Office, some clandestine agency, had been moved into the prison buildings, with no prisoners being kept there. And so when the phone in my residence rang, just prior to my evening meal, and I was requested to attend that place, it was with some apprehension that I eventually agreed. Upon my arrival at the establishment, I was met by uniformed soldiers, apparently members of an anti-aircraft detachment, which had been concealed within the grounds of the complex. They seemed to know little of the purpose for which I had been summoned, informing me their company was not allowed access to the main buildings themselves. They were aware another military unit was stationed within the interior of the prison complex, but became adversarial when I attempted any further inquiry. Several of the gunners agreed to escort me to the gatehouse, where other soldiers awaited me with their commanding officer, all wearing what I believed to have been naval insignia. He presented as a deeply conflicted and complicated soul, young in age, but clearly affected by the physical and emotional scars the war had inflicted upon him. Whilst I was led through the deserted corridors, he explained the purpose of my visit, adding there would be a short delay due to the prior arrival of two unexpected visitors. There then followed a pause as we awaited the end of their business. Two police officers, a detective inspector and a female subordinate, Midlanders, if their accents were out to go by. As they departed, and I was then encouraged to commence my ministration, I overheard the conversation between them and my escort become somewhat animated, their individual agendas clearly being in conflict with one another, despite having found themselves involved in the same unfortunate business. The prisoner who awaited me was called Nagel, a hapless youth, still clearly in his teenage years, when he had been accepted into the Luftwaffe. There was little in the way of introduction, nor pleasantry as we spoke. I do not feel he perceived me in any way on a personal level, only recognising the role I played in proceedings. His English was near perfect, which came as something as a surprise to me, no doubt because our enemy is so often portrayed as aggressive and uneducated in nature. He was a fighter pilot, who operated out of an airfield which the Germans had captured on the French coast, not far from Calais. The squadrons there had escorted the bombers, which attempted to lay waste to this city and others, before our Air Force drove them away. Since that time, they had patrolled the Channel in twos and threes, in the hope of stumbling across Royal Navy or RAF targets they could ambush. But their numbers had been few, and more often than not, insufficient to prove decisive in engagements, leading to a severe downturn in their morale, until one foggy morning, when they'd been roused from their beds by the sound of an aircraft unexpectedly approaching and landing on their runway, one which bore the roundels and insignia of the Royal Air Force, and not those of their Luftwaffe colleagues. It transpired that the Spitfire, which was taxiing along the runway before their eyes, was flown by a young Polish pilot, who'd become lost in low fog across the channel. The poor soul didn't recognise his error until he alighted from his cockpit, only to find to his horror that he was at once surrounded by the enemy. He'd turned and run back to the plane, in the apparent hope of using his signal pistol to destroy the aircraft, only for several shots to ring out. Nagel told me with some sincerity that the Germans had tried their hardest to save the boy's life, only for him to spend his dying breaths fighting them off, cursing and damning them in his native language until he succumbed to his wounds, his face a picture of rage and hate. Surveying their prize, the pilots noted with grim humour that the letters which made up the Spitfire's insignia spelt TOD, TOD, the German word for death, and it was at this point Their commanding officer proposed a bold but sinister scheme to use the Allied aircraft as bait with which to ensnare and then destroy their enemies. The captured Spitfire would be employed as a decoy with which to lure in unsuspecting Allied fighter pilots to be destroyed by nearby German fighters who were lying in wait. Volunteers were requested, and the unit's most senior pilot, a decorated flyer named Moore, was given several days to familiarise himself with the captured aircraft. The first time the Germans attempted this experiment, the results were an unqualified success. Flying alone, in an haphazard manner along the English coast, Moore encountered a pack of patrolling RAF Hurricanes, who formed up alongside him. Signalling that his radio weren't working, the German flyer duly fell in alongside the Allied aircraft, while simultaneously radioing his position to a nearby flight of 109s. The German pilots fell upon the Hurricanes like wolves, and in moments all had been destroyed, having been caught completely unawares by the trap. Emboldened by their success, the base commander gave instructions for his switchboard operators to conduct a daily ring round of other German airfields, searching for the insignia of any other Spitfires that had been downed over occupied territory in the past 48 hours. The markings of the captured aircraft were then altered every morning, in order to give credence that it might have become lost and make the deception authentic. This ruse continued for the next few days, with numerous RAF aircraft being downed. Any pilots who escaped the destruction were machine-gunned as their parachutes drifted to earth, in order to prevent the secret from being discovered. But the initial elation at the success of this deception would soon be replaced with fear and anguish. Nagel related to me how one morning a technician was loading 20mm ammunition into the Spitfire when the cannons had suddenly burst into life. A hail of gunfire had sprayed across the hangar where the aircraft were hidden, slaying 2 mechanics and resulting in the arrest of their comrade who'd been working on the plane at the time. Despite his protestations he'd not been responsible for the deaths, he was led away from the airfield, never to be seen again, with mutterings inevitably starting. The Spitfire might not be the glorious gift the pilots had thought it would be, with fate repaying them for the deaths they'd visited upon their enemies. It appears such rumour-mongering had little effect on Moore, who went on to complete 2 more patrols, resulting in the loss of 8 Allied fighters. But as he was bringing the captured Spitfire into land, after a further unsuccessful sortie, the plane had suddenly jerked uncontrollably to one side, swerving off the runway. The fireman who reached the aircraft found the pilot lying dead in his cockpit, his eyes wide open in shock and horror, hands clutching at his throat. His parachute had inexplicably discharged itself as he was coming into land, its cords binding fast around his throat, choking him to death. With the plane having suffered only minor cosmetic damage, repairs were started, and a new candidate sought to fly the Spitfire on future missions. But with 4 men now dead, all connected to the RAF plane, on this occasion there were no volunteers, leaving Nagel to be selected by his superiors in order to bring himself up to speed on how to pilot the captured enemy fighter. From the outset, the German pilot informed me there was something haunting about flying the Spitfire. Initially, he'd put this down to the circumstances in which he found himself and the stress of the mission he'd been given. But during test flights, he'd felt sudden bursts of unexplicable resistance from the controls, as if someone were trying to wrench them hard out of his grasp. Twice when coming into land, he'd been forced to yank back hard on the control column or the rudder pedals, as if some mysterious force were driving the plane off course. But when he asked to be relieved of his burden, the request was refused, his misgivings dismissed as nerves and nothing more. With a heavy heart, and with the insignia of the Spitfire again altered to one recently downed over French territory, the young pilot had set off on his mission, encountering another pair of Spitfires over the channel, and once again feigning radio issues from his cockpit, using hand signals. Watching on, forlornly, as the 2 Allied pilots were slaughtered by his fellows, the German machines falling on them without warning from the clouds above. He wasn't to know it at the time, but this would not be a process that Nagel would ever get the chance to repeat. Several days later, the Spitfire having been further disguised, the German flyer found himself approaching the English coastline in search of prey. With nothing evident, he'd informed his escorts he'd fly slightly further inland in search of the enemy, before pushing on across the English countryside. Before long, he could make out a flight of enemy aircraft ahead, and was in the process of altering his course to intercept when he suddenly stopped cold. There, reflected back at him in the glass of his instrumentation panel, were the face of the Spitfire's original pilot, the dead Pole's features just as hateful and anguished as the moment that Nagel had last seen them. With a cry, the German had pulled his pistol from its holster and turned in his seat, only to find the cockpit behind him empty, before he felt the sensation of rough hands taking hold of his throat, fingers pressing hard into his windpipe, clouding his vision. Fighting with all his heart, and as his world begun to fade to black, the German had fought not only to control the aircraft, but also the growing pressure on his throat. Noticing the RAF plane's head had turned to approach him, and as his vision grew ever darker, and the Spitfire began to roll forwards, into a downward spiral. He had a faint memory of his pistol discharging, and the shattering of glass from the canopy above. A fleeting glimpse again of a shadowy form, on top of him, its features vengeful, and then he were falling, towards the ground. Waking to find British soldiers standing around his billowing parachute, the bayonets of their rifles ready to help him, if he showed any signs of resistance. At the conclusion of our discussion, I spoke candidly with the young pilot, assuring him that he in some way had cleansed himself of his sin. I explained how the acts he'd committed had been despicable, but the fact he'd acknowledged and admitted them would likely result in some degree of divine forgiveness. Then we prayed together, two men from opposing sides of this conflict, before I was removed from his cell. The naval officer who'd summoned me thanked me for my attendance, advising me my services would likely not be needed again. The reason for this is that as Nagel has used a British aircraft as a means of deception, he will be hanged as a spy, with no trial to be held, or opportunity to defend himself and his actions, only the short drop from life to death. An act which causes me great distress, but less so than the haunting thought that he's ultimately been undone by the hatred of another. A man so enraged by the injustice of his passing that his need for revenge transcended death itself, meaning the evil I have always told others likely does not exist, is in fact perfectly capable of manifesting itself. I will petition those at the prison to allow for a funeral. God willing, they'll agree to this, in the hope I can assist the German pilot in his journey to the afterlife, unlike the fate he and his fellows have inflicted on all their victims.